Welcome to Inside IOSA Auditing, a three-part podcast series where we'll explore the ins and outs of the IATA Operational Safety Audit Standards. I'm Maria Chen, your host, with over 15 years of experience conducting internal audits for international airlines.
And I'm David Park, relatively new to the IOSA world. I've been working in airline operations for 5 years, but I'm just beginning my journey as an internal auditor. I have so many questions about how to effectively apply these standards.
And that's exactly why we created this series, David. Over these 3 episodes, we'll break down the IOSA Standards Manual, explore practical applications across all 8 operational disciplines, and dive into root cause analysis and corrective action planning.
I'm really looking forward to learning how to interpret these standards correctly. It can be intimidating when you first look at the IOSA documentation system.
That's a great place to start. Let's talk about what the IOSA Standards Manual, or ISM, actually is. In simple terms, it's the single source of all the standards and recommended practices used in IOSA audits.
So the ISM contains all the requirements that an airline needs to meet to pass an IOSA audit?
Exactly. The ISM is published to provide all IOSA standards, recommended practices, which we call ISARPs, and guidance material in one place. It's organized into 8 operational disciplines, each with its own 3-letter identifier.
I've seen those ORG, FLT, DSP, and others, right? What's the significance of those identifiers?
They help you quickly identify which operational area a requirement belongs to. ORG covers Organization and Management System, FLT is Flight Operations, DSP is Operational Control and Flight Dispatch, MNT is Aircraft Engineering and Maintenance, CAB is Cabin Operations, GRH is Ground Handling Operations, CGO is Cargo Operations, and SEC is Security Management.
That makes sense. I've noticed that each standard has a number like ORG 1.1.1 or FLT 2.3.4. Is there a logic to that numbering?
Good observation. The numbering helps track specific requirements. IATA tries to keep these reference numbers stable over time. If they need to add new standards between existing ones, they might add a letter suffix like 2.1.1a instead of renumbering the whole section.
I see. What about the difference between shall and should in the standards? I've noticed both terms are used.
That's a crucial distinction. Standards use shall and are mandatory requirements. Recommended practices use should and are desirable but not mandatory. During an audit, not meeting a standard results in a finding, while not meeting a recommended practice results in an observation.
So for internal audits, we should focus primarily on the shall requirements?
Not necessarily. While standards are must-haves for IOSA registration, recommended practices often represent industry best practices. As internal auditors, we should assess both and help our airline determine which recommended practices make sense to implement based on our operational context.
That's helpful. But there's something else I've been wondering about. Sometimes I see symbols like SMS or MA next to standards. What do those mean?
Great question. SMS indicates the standard is related to safety management system components. If your airline conforms with all standards marked SMS, IOSA considers you to have a baseline SMS in place. MA stands for Maturity Assessment, which is part of the risk-based IOSA approach. And PCO indicates a parallel conformity option, which provides an alternative means of compliance.
What about applicability? Not every standard seems to apply to all airlines.
Correct. The ISM provides guidance on applicability in several ways. Each section starts with an applicability box, explaining generally which operators the section applies to. Individual standards may also have conditional phrases starting with if the operator, which means the requirement only applies if your operation meets that condition.
So if a standard starts with if the operator conducts ETOPS flights, and my airline doesn't do ETOPS, We would mark that standard as not applicable, right?
Exactly. But make sure you document why it's NA. The auditor is the final judge of applicability, so your rationale should be clear.
Makes sense. Let's talk about some practical examples. Could you give me one example from each of the 8 disciplines?
Sure. For org, a fundamental standard is org 1.1.1, which requires a management system that ensures control of operations and safety outcomes throughout the organization. Essentially, the airline needs to function as one cohesive system, not in silos.
So we'd check for an organizational manual and structure chart showing how safety management is integrated across departments?
Exactly. For FLT, a key standard is FLT 1.7.1, requiring a comprehensive operations manual for flight crews. This manual must contain policies, procedures, and checklists necessary for regulatory compliance.
And I imagine we'd verify the manual exists, is up to date, and covers all required content?
Yes, and you might sample specific items like stabilized approach criteria or fuel policies to ensure they're included. Moving to DSP, there's typically a standard requiring a flight dispatch system appropriate to the type of operation, ensuring every flight has a formal authorization document.
What about M&T? I find maintenance requirements quite complex.
A key M&T standard concerns the Maintenance Control Manual, which must detail procedures for aircraft maintenance. During an audit, you'd verify the manual exists, is current, and contains required sections like MEL management and airworthiness directive compliance.
And for CAB operations?
KB standards cover cabin crew training programs, emergency equipment checks, and passenger management procedures. For example, there's a standard requiring cabin crew to be trained and competent in both normal and emergency duties.
And what about ground handling? That's my background.
GRH covers everything from passenger handling to ramp operations. A typical standard requires documented ground handling procedures and related training. You check that a ground handling manual exists and that staff are trained accordingly.
And CGO must cover cargo operations and dangerous goods?
Yes, CGO includes standards for cargo acceptance, documentation, and dangerous goods handling. If the airline transports dangerous goods, there must be a DG program compliant with ICAO technical instructions and IATA DGR.
Finally, what about SEC?
SEC standards address the airline security program, including security manuals, training, and measures to protect against unlawful interference. A fundamental standard requires a security program approved by the state.
This overview is incredibly helpful. But I'm curious, how do these standards interact with regulations? Are they the same?
That's a great question to end on. IOSA standards primarily come from ICAO annexes, but they're not identical to regulations. They often align with regulations, but IOSA might be broader or more specific in some areas. The key is understanding that IOSA sets a global operational safety baseline, while regulations vary by country.
I'm looking forward to our next episode where we'll dig deeper into how to apply these standards during internal audits.
Absolutely. In Part 2, we'll discuss interpreting and evaluating ISARPs and how to gather evidence effectively. Until then, remember that the IOSA standards aren't just requirements to check off. They're tools to build a safer, more efficient airline.
Thanks for the introduction, Maria. This has been Inside IOSA Auditing. Join us next time as we explore applying ISARPs in internal audits.